Hey, and welcome to Renderschool. This is VRAY Basics. It's a free course just going through all of the basics of VRAY and setting it up and working in a linear workflow and the stuff you need to know. This first class or video is on setting up VRAY to work in a linear workflow, which is of the utmost importance for making sure that your CG looks believable. So let me just switch to VRAY here real quick. I'm not going to go into what this whole linear thing is, because it's a math thing, and basically it means that if you're not working in a linear workflow, the mathematics behind what's going on in your render is going to be wrong, and of course you don't want that. But it's something you need to set up so that you get around this this wrong way of calculating your images. And if you want to know more about it, look it up on Wikipedia actually, because there's a lot of math going into it, and that's not what Renderschool is about. Renderschool is about making sure that your images come out right. So I'm just going to really quickly show you how to set up VRAY to work in a linear fashion, and there's a couple of different ways of doing it, so I'm just going to quickly go through those. So let me just create a simple scene here, just so that we can actually see what's going on. And when I said simple, I meant it. So this is our scene. Let me go ahead and create a VRAY rectangular light. And see, now we're waiting for something. Here we go. Let's just get this light in here, scale it up a bit as such, and we will hit render. And this is how it looks. You might be thinking this is very dark. Light kind of disappears extremely fast. It's just, well, goes into darkness. And that's the predicament that we want to get around, because this is not realistic. Now, the first thing we want to do is go into the VRAY Common tab of the render settings and switch to the VRAY frame buffer, so that when we hit render we get this one instead, which is really nice for loads of reasons. So let's just get rid of this guy. But to look at this image, which is actually a linear image displayed on an sRGB monitor, to look at it right, the way it's supposed to look, you want to hit this little sRGB button down here. It's tiny, but you'll find it. So if you hit that, then all of a sudden we actually get the right like fall off in the lighting and all that stuff that we wanted. So in reality, that's all good, and we're now, VRAY will always render linear, but now we're actually seeing it the way it's supposed to be seen. But we're not done yet. There's a couple of things that we want to do. First of all, VRAY works in a linear workflow or a linear manner, which means that stuff like using the adaptive DMC for anti-aliasing and general like sampling of lights and stuff will be done on this uncorrected image. But since we will be looking at it like this, all of a sudden we can see all this noise that would fall below the threshold. We'll get back to that in a later video. But it just means that we're not going to get all the sampling we want. So we need to tell VRAY to take this sRGB image into account when doing the sampling. And we do that by jumping down into color mapping in the VRAY tab and setting the gamma to 2.2, which is monitor RGB. And then we'll click Don't Affect Colors. So we're not going to color correct the image, we're just going to tell VRAY to look at a color corrected version of it when sampling. I hope that made sense. But what we'll get now is some slightly cleaner noise. Now my setting's really low, but it does clean it up. And since we checked this Don't Affect Colors, it's only in the calculation of samples it's doing this. So we're still getting all the correct lighting values and all that we wanted to. So step 1 is now done. VRAY is linear to begin with. We're looking at it as it should be looked at on an sRGB monitor, which most of our monitors are. And we're telling VRAY to be aware that we'll be looking at it in sRGB or gamma 2.2. So therefore, please make sure that you clean up the noise and all that, if it was to be rendered at 2.2. But since we have this guy on, we're not actually changing the colors. Okay, I hope that made some kind of sense, and in reality, just know what to do. Don't worry too much about it, because it's just one of those things that you want to make sure that you always do. So, the next thing that we need to take into account is that since everything is considered linear by default from VRAY's point of view, that goes for colors and textures as well. And there's two ways of getting around this. The simple way is to click this linear workflow guy and hit render and go into sRGB, and all of a sudden stuff will kind of look like it did before, but without the sRGB button pressed. So everything is going to be darkened down. And what really happens is that VRAY will take any color it finds in your textures and gamma correct those to fit within, like, pretty much the reverse of 2.2, which is it will apply a gamma of 0.4545 on everything. And this is kind of nice, because it does everything by itself. But there's also a little bit of it's a simple way of doing it, but in my eyes it's a bit annoying that it does it in everything, and I'm left without any sort of control. If you just want to really quickly render something, by all means hit this button and you'll be good to go. But if you want to do it in a more traditional manner where you have control over what you're doing, please follow along for the next couple of minutes and I will show you how that's done. Now let's start out by giving this guy a new material, and if we render it, see, we get this really bright thing, and that's because the color here, the gray color, which is like a 50% gray, hasn't been color corrected or gamma corrected to fit within to actually take into account that we're looking at it on this RGB monitor. So that means we have to gamma this guy down to a gamma of 0.4545 to actually get the value that we needed. Of course, you can just wing it and get something that looks nice, but say that this is say this red color that your client really needs in the logo or whatever. You want to make sure that it's the actual right color. So for pure colors and for textures, what you want to do here is add a texture, and actually thought I had this guy here, as a gamma correct node. And the cool thing about this is that it will take an image or whatever you want in here as a value, but you can also just set the color. So say this is the color we want to hit. That's what we want to get out of the render. So you use that as a value and gamma correct it to 0.4545 in all the channels. And lo and behold, when we render it, we actually get that color. Now, if we hadn't done this, sorry, I just paid for something. Let me just close down my mail. If we set the gamma correction back so that it's not really doing anything, we get this over bright, weird, dull version of this, which is not at all what we wanted. So let's get it back as such, hit render, and we're happy. You want to use this for pretty much any like procedural textures or whatever you want to pop in there. You can use it for file nodes as well. But if you are reading a file, there is a better way. So let's have a look at that better way on this guy here. So assign a new material. Again, it's a VRAY material. Gonna get rid of this guy here and hit file. The question is, where do I have a file we can use? I should actually have found this ahead of time, but let's grab this guy. So now we're getting these green stripes, and they actually kind of look right, but they're not. They are not as saturated as we want, not as contrasty as we want. So we'll need to gamma correct them. And the first way of doing that would be to pipe the file node through a gamma node and doing the correction in that manner. But the second way, which is my favorite, since we have VRAY running, you can, on the file node, create attributes, VRAY, and texture input gamma. It's going to pop up down here. And it's enabled and it's set to 2.2 as the input gamma. And that's because it's a PNG. And PNG, JPEG, pretty much all the usual aspects are created to be just shown directly on a monitor, which is this magical gamma 2.2. The cool thing about using this is that first of all, you don't have to figure out what the inverted gamma is. You can just tell it, well, this is 2.2. Sometimes you'll even get like 1.8 stuff, which it's a little bit weird, but such is life. If you have an EXR, for example, as your texture, you can just set this to linear, and it's pretty much gonna just ignore it. You can set it to sRGB if you know that's what it is. You kind of know that here, but you can also set it manually to whatever gamma you want. We're just going to go sRGB, hit render, and now we actually get the right rich green color that we had in the texture. And this is definitely my preferred method of doing it. And I know that the whole gamma thing, like if you want a reflection color or whatever, and you're not using a texture, you have to create a node just to set a color. It seems a little bit backwards, but it does make sense in order to control what it is that you're doing. So that is, well, there's one more thing actually. You want to make sure that you're using, just in case, using something like EXR, which is linear by default, because that way when something like Nuke reads the file, it's actually going to say, okay, this is an EXR file, and it will, by and large, be an EXR file, or sorry, a linear file, so let's keep working with it like that. So, just to recap real quick, go ahead and use the VRAY frame buffer, just so that you can do this. And render out as EXR files, set your color mapping, 2.2 in the gamma, don't affect colors. Pretty much, if I'll get back to this in a second. And you could use the linear workflow, or you could do the more slower version of it, but which will give you more control. Just really quickly, just if we don't click this don't affect colors, we will actually get this same image, but when looking at it as a linear image. So V-Ray will actually color correct it inside of the render, which is a little bit awkward because this is what you'll want to show on your screen then, and that's all pale and just doesn't look good or doesn't work well. So usually, unless you come up with some way of using this, just make sure that it's clicked and you're doing everything straight up the way it's meant to be done. So that's how you make sure to that you're working in a linear workflow. Nice and simple, and it's something that you just want to make sure to always do, whatever it is that you're rendering. Your highlights will look better, your colors will look better, and your lights will act more natural, which is, I guess, part and parcel of what we do. So, yeah, that's linear workflow. See you in the next video.